The Wyoming wind howled across the high plains, sharp as a blade and cold as regret. It was December 1887, and winter had gripped the Powder River Basin like a jealous lover, frosting the sagebrush and painting the wooden fences of Bitter Creek, ranch with ice. Snow swirled in restless flurries, catching in the cracks of the bunkhouse and dusting the shoulders of anyone brave enough to face the storm. May stepped off the stagecoach, her boots sinking into the frozen mud. Her coat, a faded gray wool duster, was patched at the hem, and her scarf, knitted from scraps of green and brown, barely held against the chill. She carried a canvas satchel, its straps worn thin, and her dark blonde hair, braided tightly, peeked from beneath a plain wool cap. Her green eyes, fierce and unyielding, scanned the ranch ahead. At 28, May had learned to walk tall, even when the world tried to bend her low. The ranch was a sprawl of weathered buildings, its main house a sturdy log structure with smoke curling from the chimney. A corral held a dozen horses, their breath steaming in the air, and a barn loomed nearby, its doors rattling in the wind. May strode toward the cookhouse, a low-clapboard shack where a faint glow flickered through the window. She'd heard in Cheyenne that Bitter Creek needed a cook, too. Feed its 30 hands through the winter. She meant to claim that job. A group of cowboys huddled near the cookhouse door, their faces half hidden under wide-brimmed hats. They stamped their boots against the cold, sharing a tin of tobacco and low, rough laughter. As May approached, their voices stilled, and their eyes turned sharp, sizing her up like a stray dog. A burly man with a wind-burned face and a patchy beard stepped forward. His voice was gruff, like gravel under boots. "This ain't a boarding." "House lady, what's your business?" May squared her shoulders, her breath clouding in the air. "I'm here to cook," she said, her voice steady and low. "Heard you're short a hand in the kitchen. I can feed your men and keep 'em working," the man snorted, his eyes narrowing. "A woman? Out here? You look like you'd blow away in this wind. We don't need trouble or soft hands." "I ain't soft," May replied, her gaze unwavering. "I've cooked for freighters, miners, and soldiers. I can stretch a sack of beans to feed a camp and make biscuits that don't break teeth. Try me." A younger cowboy, lean and smirking, spat into the snow. "She talks big. Bet she's running from a saloon or worse." The others chuckled, their breath puffing white. May's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. "I'm running. From hunger, same as you," she said. "Give me a stove and one night. If your men ain't fed by dawn, I'll walk away." The burly man studied her, his skepticism plain. Then he jerked his head toward the cookhouse. "Stove's inside. Flour's low and we're out of bacon. Prove it, or you're gone by sunrise." As May moved toward the door, her eyes swept over the group. Most avoided her gaze, their smirks fading. But one man stood apart, leaning against the corral fence, his dark wool coat buttoned high. Caleb, tall and broad-shouldered at 34, wore a black Stetson tipped low, shadowing his face. His hazel eyes, flecked with gold, watched her with a quiet intensity, not mocking like the others, but searching, as if he saw something familiar in her defiance. May held his stare for a heartbeat, her pulse quickening. She didn't know him, but something in his silence felt heavier than the wind. Pushing open the cookhouse door, she stepped into a dim, frigid room that smelled of stale grease and damp wood. A rusted stove crouched in the corner, flanked by a splintered table and a few dented pots. The shelves held only a half sack of flour, a jar of salt, and a tin of coffee grounds. She hung her satchel on a nail, rolled up her sleeves, and set to work. Outside, Caleb straightened, his gloved hands flexing. He'd seen her kind of fire before, years ago in a Laramie tavern, where a woman had stood tall against a drunk's threats and walked away unbroken. Was it her? He couldn't be sure, but the memory stirred like ash in his chest. What had brought her here, to his father's ranch, under a sky as cold as secrets? The Wyoming dawn broke pale and brittle over Bitter Creek Ranch, its light barely warming the frost that clung to the corral fences. Inside the cookhouse, May worked in the dim glow of a kerosene lamp, her breath clouding as she coaxed a fire to life in the rusted stove. Her hands, chapped from the cold, moved with purpose, kneading a stiff dough of flour and water. The air smelled of pine smoke and promise. She'd found a jar of dried apples tucked behind the salt, a small treasure in the barren pantry. With a pinch of cinnamon from her satchel, she crafted a batch of rough pastries, their edges crisp and golden. Coffee bubbled in a dented pot, its bitter scent cutting through the chill. By the time the first cowboy pushed open the door, the table held a spread of pastries, hard-boiled eggs from the henhouse, and steaming mugs. May stood by the stove, her dark blonde braid loose under her wool cap, green eyes steady, but guarded. The cowboys filed in, their boots scraping the floor, their faces skeptical. A wiry man with a crooked nose took a pastry, bit into it, and paused. "Ain't half bad," he muttered, grabbing another. Others followed, their grumbling fading as they ate. By the third morning, they came early, their tin plates clattering, their voices softer. No one said thank you, but the plates returned clean, and May took that as praise enough. She scrubbed the pots alone, her sleeves rolled high, revealing a faint scar on her forearm from a long-ago burn. The cookhouse felt less like a stranger now, its walls holding the warmth of her labor. But it was Caleb who changed the rhythm of her days. Each dawn, before the others stirred, he appeared at the door, his black Stetson dusted with snow, his hazel eyes catching the lamplight. Without a word, he hauled a bucket of water from the well or stacked fresh logs by the stove, his movements quiet but sure. May nodded her thanks, her voice low. "Appreciate it." Caleb tipped his hat, barely, meeting her gaze, then left as silently as he'd come. She noticed the small things. A new nail hammered into the loose shelf, a broom left upright after she'd forgotten it, a tin of molasses placed where her apples had run out. His kindness was wordless, like a shadow moving just out of sight, and it stirred something in her chest she wasn't ready to name. One morning, as she sliced potatoes for a hash, Caleb lingered longer than usual. He leaned against the doorframe, his dark wool coat unbuttoned, revealing a gray flannel shirt tucked into worn jeans. His broad shoulders filled the space, but his posture was easy, almost hesitant. "You always rise this early?" he asked. His voice low, like gravel warmed by sun. May glanced up, her knife pausing. "Habit," she said. "Freighters don't wait for daylight, and neither do I." She resumed cutting, her green eyes flicking to his. "You don't strike me as a man who sleeps late either." Caleb's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Ranch don't run itself." He stepped closer, picking up a rag to wipe the table, though it was already clean. Their silence wasn't heavy, but it carried weight. May felt his gaze, not judging, but searching, as if he were piecing together a puzzle she didn't know she was. She thought of the Laramie tavern, years back, where a man had watched her fend off a drunk with a broken bottle. Had it been him? The memory was a blur, but Caleb's quiet felt familiar, like a song half remembered. As he turned to leave, May spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Why do you help me? Ain't your job?" Caleb stopped, his hand on the door. He looked back, his hazel eyes steady for the first time. "Maybe I know what it's like to need a chance," he said, then stepped into the snow, leaving the door to creak shut behind him. May stared at the empty doorway, her knife still in hand. The fire crackled, warming her fingers, but a different heat bloomed in her chest. Who was this man who saw her without staring, who helped without asking for credit? And why did his words feel like they carried a story she hadn't yet heard? The Wyoming winter tightened its grip on Bitter Creek Ranch, the snow piling high against the barn and frosting the corral posts like sugar on a cake. By mid-December 1887, the Powder River Basin was a world of white, its silence broken only by the creak of frozen wood and the low moan of the wind. Inside the cookhouse, May's stove roared, its heat a small rebellion against the cold. Her days had found a rhythm. Rise before dawn, bake, boil, fry and scrub, each task a quiet defiance against the ranch's hard edges. Her dark blonde braid swung as she stirred a pot of venison stew, the scent of sage and onion curling through the air. The cowboys no longer grumbled about her cooking. They piled their plates high, their boots thumping the floor as they swapped stories of lost cattle and busted fences. May moved among them, refilling coffee mugs, her green eyes catching their nods of approval. She'd earned her place, but she kept her guard up, her scarred forearm hidden under rolled sleeves. Caleb remained her shadow, always there but never loud. Each morning he brought kindling or swept snow from the cookhouse step, his black Stetson tipped low, his hazel eyes avoiding hers, but his help grew bolder. One day he left a small sack of dried cherries by the flour bin, a rare sweetness in a land of salt and grit. May used them in a cobbler, and when the cowboys cheered, she caught Caleb's gaze across the room. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened, like sunlight breaking through clouds. That afternoon, a storm loomed, the sky bruising purple over the distant Bighorn Mountains. May stood outside, hauling a bucket of well water, her gray duster flapping in the wind. The handle slipped, and water sloshed over her boots, soaking her to the bone. She cursed under her breath, her hands numb. Before she could turn, Caleb was there, his dark wool coat dusted with snow. "Let me," he said, taking the bucket, his gloved hand brushing hers. May stepped back, her heart tripping. "I can manage," she said, but her voice was softer than she meant. Caleb set the bucket down, his broad shoulders shielding her from the wind. "I know you can," he said, his hazel eyes meeting hers, steady and warm. "But you don't always have to." For a moment they stood close, the storm's howl fading to a whisper. May felt the weight of his words, heavy with something unspoken. She broke the silence, her green eyes narrowing. "You don't owe me nothing, Caleb." "Why do you keep doing this?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I've seen folks get crushed by places like this," he said. "I don't want that for you." His voice was low, almost lost in the wind, but it carried a truth that made her chest ache. She nodded, unable to find words, and he turned, back to the barn, his boots crunching in the snow. That night, as May banked the stove's coals, she thought of Laramie again. The tavern, the drunk, the broken bottle in her hand. A man had watched from the corner, his face half hidden, but his silence had stung more than the threats. Was it Caleb? The memory gnawed at her, sharp as the cold. She shook it off, focusing on the stew pot, but her hands trembled. Outside, Caleb leaned against the corral, the storm's first flakes catching in his Stetson. He remembered Laramie, too, not the tavern, but a woman who'd stood her ground, her eyes blazing with a fire he hadn't forgotten. If it was May, what had brought her here to his father's ranch, where secrets hung heavier than snow? And why did he feel like her fire could burn through the walls he'd built around his heart? Winter's wrath descended on Bitter Creek Ranch like a judgment, the Wyoming plains buried under a blizzard that screamed through the Powder River Basin in late December 1879. Snow piled against the cookhouse, sealing the door tight, and the wind rattled the tin chimney, sending ash dancing across the floor. Inside, May fought the cold with fire, her stove a beacon in the dim room where shadows clung to the rafters like old ghosts. May's hands, rough from work, sliced carrots for a pot of hash browns, her dark blonde braid catching the flicker of the kerosene lamp. Her green eyes, stained with fatigue, stayed sharp as she stirred, the aroma of rosemary and venison filling the air. The cowboys relied on her now, their tin plates heaped with her stews and pies. their gruff voices rising. In praise when she refilled their mugs. She'd carved a place here, but the storm outside mirrored a chill growing within. A whisper of doubt about Caleb, whose hazel eyes held a story she couldn't read. The cowboys huddled in the cookhouse, their faces wind-burned, their laughter hoarse. A lanky hand named Tobin, with a scar over his brow, had ridden to Cheyenne for supplies days ago. He returned with more than flour and salt. He brought gossip. Leaning back on a bench, his boots propped on the table, he spoke low. His words sharp as barbed wire. "Heard in town about a gal like her," he said, nodding toward May at the stove. "Cooking for a gambler's crew in Laramie, mixing with rough types. Folks say she ran off after some trouble. Maybe a knife fight, maybe worse. Nah." Men shifted, their eyes flicking to May. Some chuckled, others frowned, but the words took root, souring the air. May didn't hear them, her back to the room, but she felt the change. Their glances turned cold, their thanks less warm. She kept stirring, her jaw tight, her scarred forearm hidden under her sleeve. She knew that look, the kind men gave when they thought they'd measured a woman's worth and found it wanting. Caleb heard it all, sitting at the table's edge, his black Stetson on the bench beside him. His hazel eyes darkened, his broad shoulders tensing under his gray flannel shirt. He didn't speak, but his silence was a storm of its own. When Tobin smirked and added, "Bet she's got stories she ain't tellin'," Caleb's hand clenched around his mug, his knuckles white. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor, and stepped outside, the door slamming against the wind. May noticed, her green eyes following him into the snow. She'd seen that fire in him before, not in Laramie but in her own heart, when she'd faced men who judged her past without asking her truth. Later, as she scrubbed the pots, the cookhouse empty, Caleb returned. He carried a bundle of sagebrush, its sharp scent cutting through the grease. "For the fire," he said, setting it by the stove, his voice low. She wiped her hands on her apron, her gaze steady. "You didn't have to," she said. "I don't need saving." Caleb met her eyes, his hazel flecked with gold, raw with something unspoken. "I ain't saving you," he said. "I'm just trying to do right." He paused, his jaw working. "Folks talk too much, don't mean they're right." May's breath caught. He knew about the gossip, and he hadn't laughed. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice softer, almost a challenge. Caleb looked away, his hand tracing the edge of the table. "I saw a woman in Laramie once," he said, his words slow like pulling thorns. "Stood up to a man twice her size, didn't blink. I didn't help her then. I won't make that mistake again." May's heart stuttered. Was it her? The tavern? The bottle? The fear she'd buried deep? She stepped closer, her green eyes searching his. "What's your stake in this, Caleb? You don't owe me." He met her gaze, his voice barely a whisper. "Maybe I owe myself." The words hung between them, heavy as the snow outside. Before she could answer, a gust shook the cookhouse, and the lamp flickered, casting their shadows long and tangled. May turned back to the stove, her hands trembling. Caleb lingered, then left, his boots crunching into the night. Alone she gripped the spoon, her mind racing. The gossip stung, but Caleb's words burned deeper, like a brand on her heart. Had he seen her in Laramie, or was he chasing a ghost? And why did his regret feel like a mirror to her own? Outside, Caleb stood in the blizzard, the snow stinging his face. He remembered Laramie clearer now, the woman's defiance, her eyes like green fire. If it was May, what had she carried all these years to land here, cooking for men who didn't deserve her? And what was this ache in his chest, urging him to stand between her and the storm? The blizzard had passed, leaving Bitter Creek Ranch blanketed in a silence as deep as the Wyoming snow. By early January 1880, the Powder River Basin glistened under a weak sun, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. Inside the cookhouse, May's stove burned steady, its warmth a quiet victory over the winter's bite. Her hands, calloused but sure, rolled dough for cornbread, the scent of molasses weaving through the room. Her dark blonde braid, now tied. With a scrap of red cloth swayed as she worked, her green eyes softer, but still guarded. The cowboys had settled into her meals, their plates heaped with her cornbread, bean soup, and apple tarts. The gossip from Tobin had faded, dulled by full bellies and May's unshakable grit. She moved among them, refilling coffee, her grey duster hung by the door, revealing a faded calico dress beneath. Her scarred forearm caught the light, a silent story of battles won. She'd proven her worth, but the whispers of Laramie lingered in her mind, a shadow she couldn't shake. Caleb's presence was her constant now, his black Stetson, a familiar sight at dawn. He no longer just brought kindling, or water. He stayed longer, wiping down the table or fixing a creaky hinge. His hazel eyes, flecked with gold, met hers more often, holding a warmth that made her pulse quicken. One morning, he left a small, whittled horse on the shelf, its lines smooth and careful. May touched it, her fingers tracing the grain, and felt a smile tug at her lips. That afternoon, trouble stirred. A calf, born late in the season, had wandered into a snowdrift near the corral. The cowboys, busy with broken fences, hadn't noticed. May saw it from the cookhouse window, its cries faint against the wind. Without a word, she grabbed her duster and scarf, her boots crunching through the snow. The calf was half buried, its eyes wide with fear. May knelt, her hands numb, and began digging, her breath clouding in the cold. Caleb appeared, his dark wool coat flapping, his face taut with worry. "May, what the hell are you doing?" he called, dropping beside her. "You'll freeze out here." She didn't look up, her voice fierce. "It's dying, Caleb. I ain't leaving it." He cursed softly, but joined her, his gloved hands scooping snow. Together, they freed the calf, its legs trembling as Caleb lifted it, cradling it against his chest. They stumbled back to the barn, the wind biting their faces. Inside, May rubbed the calf with straw, her hands shaking but steady. Caleb built a fire in the corner, his hazel eyes watching her with something like awe. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice low. May met his gaze, her green eyes blazing. "I know what it's like to be left behind," she said. "I won't do that to anything living." The words hung heavy, raw with truth. Caleb's jaw tightened, and he stepped closer, the firelight flickering across his face. "I saw you in Laramie," he said, his voice rough. 5 years back in that tavern. You held a bottle like a weapon, facing down a man who didn't deserve to breathe your air. I should have stepped in. I didn't, and I've carried that ever since." May froze, her heart pounding. It was him, the man in the shadows, silent when she'd needed a voice. She stood, her hands clenched. "Why tell me now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Caleb's eyes didn't waver. "Because you're not just surviving here, May. You're living. And I want to be the man who stands with you, not behind you." The barn was quiet, save for the calf's soft breaths and the fire's crackle. May's eyes searched his, seeing the regret, the hope, the man he was trying to be. She stepped back, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can trust that yet." Caleb nodded, his face pained but resolute. "I'll wait," he said, and turned to the fire, giving her space. That night, May sat by the cookhouse stove, the whittled horse in her hands. The memory of Laramie stung, but Caleb's words echoed louder, like a promise carved in wood. Could she let go of the past enough to see the man he was now? Or was her heart too scarred to believe in second chances? Outside, Caleb stood by the corral, the snow reflecting the stars. He'd spoken his truth, but it felt like a rope thrown into the dark. Would May catch it, or had he lost her trust before he ever had it? The Wyoming winter softened as January 1880 waned, the snow on Bitter Creek Ranch settling into a quiet sheen under the Powder River Basin's pale sky. The wind still whispered, but its bite had dulled, as if the land were holding its breath. Inside the cookhouse, May's stove glowed, its heat wrapping the room like a promise. Her hands, steady despite their calluses, shaped dough for a molasses pie, the sweet scent mingling with sage from a pot of beef broth. Her dark blonde braid, tied with a red cloth, fell over her shoulder, and her green eyes held a new light. Wary, but warm, like a fire banked low. The cowboys filled the cookhouse each dawn, their boots tracking snow, their voices loud with tales of spring drives. Tobin's gossip had faded, replaced by gruff nods for May's pies and stews. She moved among them, her calico dress swaying, her scarred forearm a badge of her resilience. The whittled horse from Caleb sat on the shelf, a silent reminder of the man who'd stirred her heart and her doubts. His confession about Laramie lingered, a wound she wasn't sure she could heal. Caleb's hazel eyes followed her, no longer avoiding her gaze. He brought kindling daily, but now he lingered, sharing small words about the weather, the horses, the ranch. One evening he stayed after the others left, his black Stetson in hand, his gray flannel shirt rolled to the elbows. "Pie smells." "Good," he said, leaning against the table, his voice low and easy. May glanced up, her hands dusting flour. "Better than your coffee," she teased, a rare smile tugging her lips. Caleb chuckled, the sound warm, like sunlight on snow. Their ease was new, fragile, but it grew roots in the quiet moments, his hand brushing hers as he passed a mug, her nod when he fixed a loose board. Yet Laramie hung between them, a ghost neither could banish. That night, a lantern flickered in the cookhouse, its light casting soft shadows. May sat by the stove, mending a tear in her duster, her needle moving with care. The door creaked, and Caleb stepped in, his dark wool coat unbuttoned, snow dusting his shoulders. "Thought you'd be sleepin'," he said, his hazel eyes searching. Hers. "Too much to fix," May replied, nodding at the coat. She paused, her voice softer. "Why are you here, Caleb?" He hesitated, then pulled a chair close, sitting across from her. "I owe you more than I said," he began, his words slow, heavy. "I'm Caleb Stone. My pa owns this ranch. I left years ago after the war to prove I could stand on my own. Came back last fall, asked him to keep my name quiet. Didn't want the men treating me different." May's needle stilled, her green eyes wide. "You're the boss's son?" she asked, her voice tight. "All this time you've been watching me like some secret?" Caleb shook his head, his face pained. "Not watching. Trying to earn your trust. In Laramie, I saw you fight, May. I was a coward then, too scared to step up. I won't be that man again." She stood, her hands trembling, the duster falling to the floor. "You think telling me now makes it right?" she said, her voice raw. "I fought alone that night, Caleb. You don't get to rewrite it with kindling and carved horses." Her words cut, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of hurt, not just anger. Caleb rose, his hazel eyes steady. "I ain't rewriting it," he said. "I'm asking to start new. You don't owe me nothing, but I'm here, May, if you'll let me be." The lantern sputtered, its light dimming. May's breath hitched, her heart torn between the past and the man before her. She picked up the duster, her voice barely a whisper. "Trust ain't given, Caleb. It's earned." She turned to the stove, stirring the broth, but didn't ask him to leave. He nodded, his face resolute, and stepped into the night, the door, closing softly behind him. Alone, May sank into the chair, her fingers tracing the whittled horse. Caleb's truth was a weight, but it wasn't cruel. He'd bared his soul, not to save himself, but to stand with her. Could she build something new with a man who'd once failed her? or would Laramie's shadow keep her heart locked tight? Outside, Caleb stood under the stars, the snow crunching beneath his boots. He'd given her his name, his shame, his hope. Would it be enough, or had he bared his heart only to lose her to the ghosts they both carried? Spring crept into the Powder River Basin like a shy guest, softening the Wyoming snow into rivulets that sparkled under the April 1880 sun. Bitter Creek Ranch stirred with life, its corral bustling with horses, its fences mended under a sky as wide as hope. The cookhouse, once a cold refuge, now hummed with warmth, its stove glowing as May baked a tray of sage biscuits, their scent drifting through the open door. Her dark blonde braid, loose and tied with a red cloth, caught the breeze, and her green eyes shone with a quiet joy. Her calico dress, patched but clean, swayed as she moved, her scarred forearm no longer hidden, a mark of her strength. The cowboys still filled her table, their laughter loud, their plates piled with her biscuits, stews, and cherry pies. Tobin's gossip was a distant memory, replaced by gruff thanks and calls for seconds. May had become their anchor, her meals a ritual that bound the ranch together. But it was Caleb who held her heart, his hazel eyes no longer shadowed by Laramie's ghost. He'd earned her trust, not with words but with time. Each kindling bundle, each repaired shelf, each moment he stood by her side. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the Bighorn Mountains gold, May found a note tucked under the whittled horse on her shelf. Caleb's handwriting, steady and spare, read, "Meet me by the creek at dusk." Her pulse quickened, and she slipped on her gray duster, her boots crunching through the last patches of snow. By the creek, Caleb waited, his black Stetson in hand, his gray flannel shirt open at the collar. His hazel eyes, flecked with gold, held a nervous light, but his voice was firm. "I ain't good with words, May," he began, stepping closer. "But I know what's true. You're the fire in this place, and I want to build something with you, a home, not just a ranch." He pulled a small ring from his pocket, a simple band of silver etched with a sage leaf. "Will you stay? Not for them, not for me, but for us?" May's breath caught, her green eyes searching his. Laramie's pain was there, but it no longer ruled her. She saw the man he'd become, the one who'd chosen her truth over his shame. She took the ring, her fingers brushing his, and nodded. "I'll stay," she whispered, her voice thick. Caleb slid the ring onto her finger, his touch gentle, and they stood by the creek, the water singing softly, their shadows merging in the fading light. Months later, a small cabin rose near the ranch, its logs golden in the summer sun. May's kitchen gleamed with jars of preserves, her biscuits cooling on a new table. Caleb worked beside her, his hands planting sage in a garden they'd built together. Their wedding was quiet, just them, a preacher, and the wind under a cottonwood tree. May wore her calico dress, a sage sprig in her braid. Caleb wore his best shirt, his smile unguarded. They vowed to hold each other's truths, not their pasts. The cowboys came to their table now, not just for food but for stories, laughter, and the warmth of a home they'd never had. May taught a ranch hand's daughter to bake, her hands guiding small fingers through dough, her laughter free. Caleb watched, his hazel eyes soft, knowing he'd found his place beside her. As the sun set over Bitter Creek, May and Caleb sat on their porch, the sage garden fragrant, the stars waking above. They'd built something stronger than shame, brighter than regret, a love that didn't demand perfection, only presence, and that was there forever. Thank you for riding this trail with May and Caleb, through Wyoming's storms and into the quiet grace of love reborn. If their story warmed your heart, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of frontier passion and second chances. Like, share, and drop a comment. What's the love story that stayed with you? Let's keep the fire burning.